I was really interested by what you were talking about there, about the idea of trauma being buried. Because for me, and I'd be interested to get your thoughts on this as well, in the sense that I think that so much of, well, there's so many issues in society which can almost come back to buried trauma in some ways. And a lot of it's not even necessarily buried. It's sort of trauma reactions that are manifesting. But one thing I'm interested in is the relationship between trauma reactions and personality disorders, because these are things that are linked, aren't they? And quite often we can have people in society who, you know, they may seem a bit of an antisocial person, they may not be someone that we want to mix with, but quite often it can be an undiagnosed trauma reaction that they're going through. Or, look, we'll get into this a little bit later on, but even things like intergenerational trauma can have an effect.
Yes, I think the impact of trauma on people's mental health is one of the most under-recognised aspects of factors that impact on people's mental health, because so much of mental health research and in psychiatry would emphasise the idea of it comes down to biochemical imbalances, say for depression, and the notion of that's going to relate to your genetics and all the rest of it. There's so much emphasis on biology and genes, it tended to recognise the impact of the environment, and the most substantial impact from the environment is trauma. And if we think of the background with this as well, like how come it's only in such recent years that there's been such exposure of the impact of child sexual abuse, including church-related child sexual abuse? Why is it that didn't come out so much like decades ago? Well, it's partly because it was de-emphasised. The impact of trauma was de-emphasised. And I found that, as I mentioned, working in a psychiatric hospital around 1990, the late 80s, the early 90s, a number of us were very concerned about the impact of trauma, but many of our colleagues were explicitly sceptical about the relevance of trauma. I remember there was a senior psychiatrist in 1990 saying, well, what's all this about sexual abuse? As though we shouldn't be talking about it. And some of us were thinking, wait a minute, we're just seeing more and more signs of this, and rather than people inventing it or seeing abuse or trauma when it wasn't there, it was more that when people have experienced trauma, they're often absolutely keeping it to themselves. And unfortunately, when you mentioned about personality impacts, one of the ways that chronic trauma, such as repeated childhood sexual abuse, one of the ways it can affect people is developing what we call borderline personality characteristics. And borderline personality characteristics are marked by painful emotions, impulsive behaviour, difficulty regulating affect, difficulty establishing stable relationships. So there tends to be more conflict in relationships, sometimes attaching very closely to someone and then afterwards having very disrupted relationships with anger reactions or impulsivity. Now, many people, I would say the majority of people with borderline personality symptoms have experienced significant past trauma, often in the form of sexual abuse, childhood sexual abuse or repeated childhood trauma, sometimes neglect. Now, not only has a person had the challenge in life of very untoward and difficult experiences to deal with as a child, but if they presented to a psychiatric hospital, say in early adult life or in their 30s or whatever, with these problems with anger and impulsive behaviour, often people were treated as though they had a rotten personality. So the essence of borderline reactions is it develops from difficulty dealing with painful emotions and an invalidating environment. Now, the invalidating environment might have been the abusive environment the person encountered in childhood, but then they turn up to a psychiatric hospital and be invalidated all over again, like there's some rotten aspects to their personality. So borderline personality disorder overlaps a lot with chronic trauma, and one of the most worthwhile things that has happened in recent decades in mental health is becoming more aware of the impact of trauma that way. There are also a tendency to be avoidant in personality too, so it could be social anxiety and avoidance. And also naturally people will sometimes be a little bit more paranoid, meaning more wary of other people and their motives if people have experienced repeated, especially childhood sexual abuse or physical abuse. Naturally people will learn to be wary of others. And so what tends to happen with trauma is it tends to affect our view of the world, that we no longer view the world as safe or people as trustworthy. If the person's been, say, abused by someone else, deliberately, that tends to have an impact different from, say, a natural disaster, trauma. If someone's actually abused someone deliberately, then naturally that wariness will be there in the sense of just the world not being safe and the people around you not being trustworthy.